The rain hadn't let up in 3 days, a gray, viscous curtain that smeared the Mississippi Delta into blurry shades of green and brown. Lena Hansen pulled her rental SUV onto the shoulder of Highway 19, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle. The air hung thick and heavy, smelling of wet earth and something else, something metallic and subtly wrong. She'd come to Darrow, Louisiana, chasing a story about localized flooding, a slow, burn piece about the creeping erosion of the coastline. Honestly, it was assignment Siberia for a journalist who once covered geopolitical hotspots. A penance, maybe. After Baltimore, she pushed the thought down, a familiar ache in her chest. Lena adjusted the microphone clipped to her lapel, keying her phone. Checking in, still nothing dramatic. Just a lot of water, sending visuals. "Keep an eye on the levee," Lena, her editor, Mark, said, his voice tinny through the speaker. "Old man Tiber's been complaining about structural fatigue for months, but the Corps of Engineers keeps saying it is solid, right? Solid as a sieve." Apparently, Lena scanned the earthen wall stretching alongside the river. It was immense, a bulwark against the Mississippi's power. But the relentless rain was different. It wasn't a gradual overflow. It was a soaking, a saturation. She could practically feel the earth softening. Then she saw him. A hairline fracture, high on the levee face, near one of the overflow weirs. It wasn't much, a dark seam in the mud and grass. But as she watched, mesmerized, the seam widened. Water began to weep through, then trickle, then pour Mark. Lena said, her voice suddenly tightened. "I think I am looking at a breach." "What a breach, are you sure?" She didn't answer, just hit the record button on her phone and started filming. The trickle escalated into a torrent, a muddy cascade ripping chunks from the levee's face. Within seconds, it was a full, blown rupture, a gaping wound in the protective wall. The Mississippi, freed from its constraints, surged forward, a brown, angry monster. "Oh God," she breathed, lowering the phone slightly. The sound was deafening, subit a roar of water and collapsing earth. She quickly backed the SUV further from the road, watching in horror as the water spread, consuming the fields and forest along the riverbank. It was moving fast, too fast. Within an hour, Highway 19 was underwater. Lena found herself stranded on a slightly elevated patch of ground near a gas station, along with a handful of other onlookers. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, a thin, desperate cry against the backdrop of the raging flood. Sheriff Brody was already here, directing traffic through a futile effort, considering there wasn't no traffic, only rising water. Shouldered man with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too much. He moved with a quiet authority that commanded attention. "You a reporter?" he asked, approaching Lena. Lena Hansen Thumprubune. She showed him her press pass. Heard you were sniffing around about the flooding." He didn't bother to take the pass. "This is bad, real bad, but it is just a natural disaster. Happens every so often when the river gets angry." "But the levee," Lena started, gesturing towards the breach. "Old man Tiber's warnings," Brody said with a dismissive wave. "He has been predicting disaster for 20 years. It is the rain, historic rainfall. Nothing more. That fracture, I saw it start. It wasn't a gradual thing. It just gave way, Brody. Gaze narrowed. You saw? Huh? You are pretty close to the river for someone covering localized flooding." Lena bristled. "I was following the story. I have a right to be here. Everyone has a right to be here until the water gets high enough that you don't." He paused, his eyes sweeping over her. "You wouldn't happen to be Lena Hansen, who had a bit of trouble with a story a few years back, would you?" Baltimore wasn't it? The question hung in the air, a familiar, unwelcome weight. Baltimore. A story about corruption, a source who disappeared, allegations of fabricated evidence. Her career had almost ended then, salvaged only by a grudging retraction and a reassignment to softer stories. "That was a misunderstanding," Lena said, keeping her voice level. "The story was complex, and sources proved unreliable. Unreliable sources don't usually disappear, Miss Hansen." Brody wasn't buying it. "Just be careful what you report this time. Don't he go stirring up trouble where there isn't any. He turned away, barking orders into his radio. Lena felt a surge of frustration. He was dismissing her, writing her off as a troublemaker. But something felt wrong. This wasn't just about the rain. There was something about the speed of the breach, the way it happened, and Brody's eagerness to attribute it to natural causes. As the water continued to rise, swallowing fields and isolating homes, Lena realized this wasn't just a flood story. It was a disaster unfolding, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She refocused her camera, panning across the submerged landscape. The floodwaters had a strange clarity, revealing structures and areas she hadn't known existed. She noticed a line of dilapidated houseboats nestled amongst the trees, completely hidden from the highway. Then, further out, almost swallowed by the murky depths, she saw something else: rooftops. Not the roofs of sturdy, modern homes. These were ramshackle structures, patched together with corrugated iron and plywood. They belonged to a hidden community, a cluster of dwellings built on stilts and forgotten by the world. People were living shuni the floodplain, concealed from view. It explained a lot: why the Corps of Engineers dismissed Tiber's concerns, why the local authorities seemed so complacent. The existence of this hidden population undermined the official narrative of seasonal flooding. It suggested a deliberate neglect, a systemic failure to protect those who were already vulnerable. She zoomed in, her heart pounding. People were on those rooftops, small figures waving frantically. Most were clustered together, calling for help. But one figure was different. Standing alone on the roof of a particularly dilapidated shack, a person was deliberately obscuring their face, shielding it from view with a hand. They were waving, yes, but it wasn't a desperate plea for rescue. It was a signal, a deliberate, measured wave. Lena adjusted her focus, trying to get a clearer image. The rain was coming down harder now, blurring the scene. But she could still make out the silhouette. The figure was tall, lean, and their movements were purposeful, almost military. Who were these people, and why were they hiding, Mark? Lena said into her phone, her voice barely a whisper. I think I just found something big. There is a hidden community out there, and someone doesn't want to be found. Static crackled on the line. Lena, the signal, breaking up. What did you say? The water was almost to the gas station. Pumps now. She could feel the vibrations through the ground before Lena could repeat herself. The figure on the rooftop lowered their hand, their face still hidden. But as they did, Lena noticed something else. A glint of metal catching the faint light. It wasn't a reflection, it was a weapon. The gas station, once a beacon of roadside convenience, was now an island rapidly shrinking. Lena gripped the doorframe of the SUV, watching Sheriff Brody organize a makeshift evacuation using a flatbed truck and a small fleet of fishing boats. He wouldn't meet her eye, clearly. Her questions hadn't been appreciated. Going somewhere, Ms. Hanson, Brody called out, without looking at her. I'm going to try and reach those people on the rooftops, she replied, stating the obvious. Brody scoffed. You're a reporter, not a rescue worker. Leave that to the professionals. Someone needs to document this, to tell their story. Their story is they built in a floodplain, end of story. He gestured towards a battered fishing boat being prepared for another run. I advise you to stay put. Lena knew arguing would be pointless. Brody had made his position clear. She wasn't welcome. She was on her own. She found old man Tiber huddled beneath the awning of the gas station, his face etched with grim satisfaction. He'd been muttering about this day for years, and now his predictions were coming true. You heading out there? He rasped, noticing her gaze fixed on the water. I'm going to try. Do you know anything about the people living out there? Tiber's eyes, clouded with age, sharpened slightly. The shadow settlements ain't spoken of much around here. Folks pretend they don't exist. Been that way for generations. Why? Old history, bad blood, they're different. Keep to themselves, don't want trouble. And folks around here, they don't want Subi them. What kind of trouble? Tiber shook his head, a wary look crossing his face. Stories, rumors, nothing concrete, just best left alone. He paused, studying her. You a nosy one, aren't you? I'm a journalist. Samey thing. He pointed a gnarled finger towards a small, weathered boat tied to a partially submerged dock. That there is Earl's, he runs charters. If anyone knows the waterways, it is him. But don't expect a warm welcome. He ain't fond of outsiders. Finding Earl proved easy. He was a wiry man with the sun-baked skin of a seasoned fisherman and a permanent scowl. He agreed to take her, but his price was exorbitant, and his manner was hostile. $500 round trip, and you do exactly as I say. 500, Lena protested. That is highway robbery. This indeed the highway, Earl retorted, gesturing at the flooded road. And it is getting more dangerous by the minute. She paid him, silently fuming. As they puttered through the murky water, navigating around submerged trees and debris, Lena felt a growing sense of unease. The landscape felt wrong, oppressive, like something was watching her. The settlements were more extensive than she'd imagined, a network of interconnected platforms and shacks built on stilts, woven together with rickety walkways. It wasn't a haphazard arrangement, it was deliberate, intricate. Someone had put a lot of effort into building this hidden world. As they approached, faces appeared at the windows and doorways, peering out with suspicion. The silence was palpable, broken only by the thrum of the engine. Earl cut the motor, letting the boat drift. Here we are. Don't expect a parade. Lena stepped onto the wobbly wooden dock, her boots sinking slightly into the damp wood. A small crowd had gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. A woman with weathered skin and piercing blue eyes stepped forward. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "I'm Lena Hansen, I'm a reporter. I want to understand what happened here and how you're coping with the flood." The woman's eyes narrowed. "A reporter. Just what we need. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to tell your story. Our story is our own. We don't need outsiders sticking their noses in our business. Please," Lena pleaded. "People need to know you exist. You've been forgotten. This flood, it has brought your situation to light. You deserve to be heard." The woman hesitated, glancing at the faces behind her. "We're the Dubois family," she said finally, her voice softening slightly. "My name is Marie, and we've been living here for generations. Ever since our ancestors were displaced. Displaced from where?" Marie's jaw tightened. "That is a long story, one we don't like to talk about. I have time. Over the next few hours." As the rain continued to fall, Lena slowly gained Marie's trust. She learned that the Dubois and other families had settled in the floodplain decades ago, driven off their land by a wealthy landowner who wanted to build a sugar plantation. They'd been forced to retreat into the swamp, building a life hidden from the outside world. "They wanted us gone," Marie said, her voice filled with bitterness. "Said we were squatters, said we didn't belong, so we built our own world, a world they couldn't touch." Lena wrote furiously in her notebook, piecing together the fragments of history. The settlers had deliberately chosen a location that was difficult to access, a labyrinth of waterways and dense vegetation. They'd relied on their knowledge of the land and their ability to remain hidden. "Did the authorities know you were here?" Lena asked. Marie shrugged. "They knew, but they turned a blind eye. It was easier that way. We didn't cause trouble, and they didn't ask questions. But the levee, the lack of maintenance." "We warned them," Marie interjected, her voice rising. "We told them the levee wasn't strong enough, but they didn't listen. They never listened to us." As she spoke, Lena noticed a group of men watching them from a distance. Their expressions unreadable. They were older, tougher looking than the others, and they carried themselves with a quiet intensity. "Who are they?" Lena asked. Marie's gaze followed hers. "The guardians, they protect us. Make sure no one comes snooping around." The atmosphere had shifted. The initial wariness had been replaced by a palpable tension. Lena felt like she was being assessed, weighed, and measured. Earl, who had been silently observing the interaction, cleared his throat. "Time to go, Miss Hansen. It is getting dark, and this ain't a safe place to be after sunset." Lena agreed. She had enough material for a story, but she knew she'd only scratched the surface. As they began the journey back, she promised Marie she would return. Back on dry land, Lena immediately called Sheriff Brody, hoping to share her findings. He was predictably dismissive. "A few families living in the swamp, that is hardly news, Ms. Hansen. They've been there for years. They're eccentric, best to leave them be. They were deliberately isolated, they were forced off their land. and they warned authorities about the levee. People say a lot of things, Ms. Hanson. You're letting your imagination get the better of you. Brody's tone was condescending. I suggest you focus on the rescue efforts. That is a real story. He hung up before she could respond. Lena felt a surge of anger. He was actively obstructing her investigation, dismissing the plight of these forgotten people. She returned to her rental car, exhausted and frustrated. She checked her voicemail. One new message, a distorted, synthesized voice filled the speaker. Some things are better left underwater. The line went dead. Lena stared at her phone, a cold dread washing over her. This wasn't just about a flood story anymore. It was about something much darker. Someone didn't want her digging, and they were willing to threaten her to keep her quiet. The synthesized threat replayed in Lena's mind, a chilling echo in the otherwise quiet rental car. Some things are better left underwater. It wasn't a generic warning. It felt personal, targeted. She needed to understand what she was up against, and that meant digging deeper. She started at the Darrow Parish Library, a small, unassuming building that smelled of old paper and dust. The librarian, a kindly woman named Mrs. Abernathy, was remarkably helpful, pointing Lena towards the local history section. We don't get many researchers interested in the past around here, she said with a smile. Most folks are too busy dealing with the present. Lena spent hours poring over microfilms, old newspapers, and parish records. The trail was faint, obscured by time and deliberate omissions, but she eventually found it. A series of articles from the early 1960s detailing a controversial land acquisition project spearheaded by the Moreau Sugar Corporation. The company, owned by the prominent Moreau family, had purchased vast tracts of land along the Mississippi River, ostensibly for expansion. But the articles hinted at something more sinister. Numerous small landowners, mostly black families, had been pressured to sell their property at drastically undervalued prices. Many had been forced off their land through legal loopholes and intimidation tactics. She referenced the land deeds with current maps of the shadow settlements. The overlap was undeniable. The land where the Dubois and other families had built their hidden community had been part of the Moreau acquisition. Lena then tracked down Elijah Washington, a 92-year-old man who had been a young boy during the land grab. He lived in a modest, kept house on the outskirts of Darrow, the sole survivor of his family who originally owned land in the disputed area. They came with papers, with lawyers, Elijah said. His voice raspy with age. He sat on his porch, a faded photograph album resting on his lap. Said the land was ours. Said we never had a proper deed. My daddy, he fought them. He said this land had been in our family for generations, but they had the money, the power. They wore him down. What happened then? Lena asked. They gave us next to nothing for the land, just enough to move to town, into those cramped little houses. We lost everything. Our home, our livelihood, our history. He flipped through the photo album, stopping at a picture of a thriving farm. This was our life before they took it all away. Lena felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. The Moreaus hadn't just bought land, they'd stolen it, destroying lives in the process. She continued her research, uncovering a network of connections between the Moreaus and other powerful families in Darrow Parish. The Thibodeaux, the Lacroix, the Fontaine-Seuin all had benefited from the land acquisition, either directly or through investments in the Moreau Sugar Corporation. And then she found something that tied it all together. The levee system, the current levee, the one that had failed so catastrophically, had been designed and built shortly after the land grab. Though incomplete, suggested that corners had been cut, that the levee wasn't built to withstand the type of prolonged rainfall Darrow had experienced. It was almost as if the levee had been deliberately designed to fail, to further displace the remaining families who hadn't been forced off their land during the acquisition. The pieces were falling into place, forming a disturbing picture of systemic corruption and calculated negligence. As Lena was leaving the library, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside her. A man in an expensive suit, his face as hard and polished as the car. "Stepped out, Miss Hanson, I presume," he said, his voice smooth and authoritative. "My name is Charles Devereaux. I represent the Moreau family." "I thought so," Lena replied, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. Devereaux held up a hand. "Let's not do anything rash. I just want to have a friendly chat." My clients are concerned about some of the questions you've been asking around town. I am a journalist. Asking questions is what I do. Some questions are best left unasked, Ms. Hanson. The Moreaus have been pillars of this community for generations. They've contributed a great deal to the economic well-being of Darrow Parish. A negative story could have serious repercussions. Are you threatening me? Devereaux smiled, a chillingly polite expression. Let us call it a friendly word of caution. My clients are prepared to defend their reputation vigorously, and they have the resources to do so. I am not intimidated, Lena said, though her heart was pounding in her chest. I suspect you are. Just consider this. The truth is often complicated. There are multiple sides to every story. Sometimes it is better to focus on the present rather than dredging up the past. He handed her a card. Think about it. Miss Hanson, and remember, some wounds are better left to heal. He turned and walked back to the SUV, leaving Lena standing on the sidewalk, feeling a mixture of anger and fear. Devereaux's visit confirmed her suspicions. She was onto something big, something that powerful people wanted to keep buried, and they were willing to go to great lengths to silence her. Determined to uncover the truth, Lena decided to visit the Darrow Parish Historical Society. She hoped to find more information about the land grab and the original engineering plans for the levee. The Historical Society was located in a dilapidated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. The curator, a frail elderly woman named Mrs. Dubois, no relation to the settlement families as far as Lena could tell, was initially hesitant to grant her access to the archives. Most of our records are incomplete, she said with a nervous glance. We've had a few incidents of vandalism over the years. But Lena persisted, explaining her research and her desire to understand the history of Darrow Parish. Finally, Mrs. Dubois relented, leading her to a dusty, dimly lit basement room. Be careful down here, she said. It has been neglected for years. Lena navigated through piles of forgotten documents and artifacts, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. She found boxes filled with tax records, property deeds, and old photographs. And then she found a hidden chamber, concealed behind a bookshelf. The chamber was small and windowless, filled with rows of metal filing cabinets. Most of the files were missing, but a few remained. They were labeled Moreau Land Acquisition Footing Confidential and Levee Construction Foodie Project Nightingale. Lena opened the first file, her hands trembling. The documents inside were heavily redacted, with large portions blacked out. But even through the censorship, she could make out disturbing details about the land grab, evidence of forged deeds, manipulated appraisals, and threats against landowners. She opened the Project Nightingale file. The engineering reports were even more heavily censored than the land acquisition documents. But she could see that the original plans for the levee had been altered, that critical safety features had been omitted. And then, on the last page of the file, she found something that made her blood run cold. A symbol. A stylized serpent coiled around a cane. She didn't recognize it, but it felt ancient, ominous. As she traced the outline of the symbol with her finger, she heard a noise behind her, a shuffling sound. She turned around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. The chamber was empty, but she had the distinct impression that she wasn't alone. Someone had been watching her, someone who didn't want her to discover the secrets hidden in this room. The symbol burned in Lena's mind, a convoluted knot of lines and curves that seemed to writhe and shift the longer she looked at it. It wasn't a readily identifiable brand, a corporate logo, or even a religious icon. It felt older, more arcane. She needed an expert. Someone who understood the history of the region, its hidden corners and forgotten lore. Mrs. Abernathy at the library had mentioned a local historian, a retired professor named Dr. Alistair Finch, who specialized in Louisiana folklore and fraternal organizations. Dr. Finch lived in a rambling, filled house on the outskirts of town. He was a frail man with a shock of white hair and eyes that twinkled with intellectual curiosity. He listened intently as Lena described the symbol, sketching it on a notepad as she spoke. Interesting, he murmured, examining the drawing. Very interesting. That is the mark of the Riverwatch Society. The Riverwatch Society, Lena asked. a secretive fraternal organization that was quite influential in this region during the mid-20th century, composed of wealthy planters, businessmen, and local politicians. They held considerable power, and they weren't afraid to use it. What did they do? Officially, they were dedicated to preserving the natural heritage of the Mississippi River. But in reality, they were more interested in controlling it, controlling the flow of commerce, the distribution of wealth, the very lifeblood of the Delta. Lena's mind raced. The land grab, the altered levee plans. It was all starting to connect. Were they involved in the Moreau land acquisition? Dr. Finch nodded. Several of the founding members of the Riverwatch Society were directly involved. The Moreauas, the Thibodeaux, the LaCroix-Suin. They were all members. They used the society as a tool to consolidate their power and expand their holdings. And the symbol, what does it represent? The serpent and the cane are ancient symbols of power and authority, Dr. Finch explained. In this context, it represents their control over the river, over the land, and over the people who depend on them. He paused, his eyes clouding over. They believed they were entitled to everything. They saw themselves as the rightful masters of the Delta. Lena spent the rest of the day sifting through Dr. Finch's extensive collection of historical documents. She found references to the Riverwatch Society in old newspapers, town council minutes, and personal correspondence. They had wielded immense influence, shaping local ordinances, manipulating elections, and suppressing dissent. She also discovered evidence suggesting a direct connection between the Riverwatch Society and the levee system. Documents indicated that the society had lobbied heavily for control over the design and construction of the levee, pushing for cost-cutting measures that compromised its structural integrity. It was a deliberate act of sabotage, a calculated risk, designed to benefit the society's members. By controlling the flow of the river, they could control the economy, the land values, and ultimately, the lives of the people who lived along its banks. The realization was chilling. The levee hadn't failed due to natural causes. It had been engineered to fail, and the people responsible were still in power. Back at her motel room, Lena spread out her research notes, photos and documents across the bed. She decompiled a damning case, a story that would expose the corruption and negligence that had led to the disaster. She had a copy of the original levee construction plans, a faded blueprint she managed to obtain from the Historical Society. It clearly showed the safety features that had been omitted, the corners that had been cut. It was the key piece of evidence she needed. She decided to make a digital backup, just in case. As she was copying the file to her laptop, she heard a noise outside her door. A faint creak, a muffled scrape. Someone was trying to get in. Her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly shut down her laptop, grabbed her phone, and glanced around for a weapon. The only thing within reach was a heavy glass ashtray. The doorknob rattled. Then, with a sharp click, the lock gave way. Lena braced herself, adrenaline surging through her veins. The door swung open slowly, revealing a shadowy figure silhouetted against the hallway light. Before she could react, the figure lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. She screamed, swinging the ashtray wildly. It connected with something solid, and the figure grunted in pain. But the attack didn't stop. The figure pinned her down, attempting to wrest her phone from her grasp. She fought back with everything she had, kicking and clawing. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally released her and fled, disappearing into the darkness. Lena sat up, gasping for breath, her body trembling. She checked herself for injuries. A bruised arm, a scraped knee, a pounding headache, but thankfully nothing broken. She looked around the room. It was a mess. Furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. And then she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The folder containing the original levee construction plans was gone. Someone hadn't just wanted to intimidate her. They had wanted to silence her, and they had taken the one piece of evidence that could expose their crimes. She grabbed her phone and dialed Sheriff Brody's number. He didn't answer. She left a frantic voicemail, detailing the attack and the theft. But she knew, deep down, that she couldn't rely on him. She was on her own, and she was running out of time. The Riverwatch Society was just a historical footnote. They were still around. and they were determined to protect their secrets, no matter the cost. The chipped formica of the diner booth felt cold beneath Lena's palms. She'd requested a meeting with Sheriff Brody, bypassing dispatch and going straight to the source. He arrived late, his face tight with annoyance. "You have 5 minutes, Miss Hanson. I'm a busy man." Lena pushed a file folder across the table, containing copies of her research, photographs, and Dr. Finch's notes on the Riverwatch Society. "I think you'll find this interesting, Sheriff. It explains why the levee breached and who is responsible." Brody didn't even glance at the contents of the folder. "You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Hanson. Old grievances. You have no proof of a conspiracy. I have evidence of deliberate negligence, altered construction plans, a decades long pattern of corruption. The Riverwatch Society manipulated the levee system to benefit their members. They wanted control, and they were willing to sacrifice lives to get it." Brody finally looked up, his eyes like chips of ice. "You've been talking to that old fool Finch. He fills young reporters' heads with fairy tales. I've also been talking to the people of the shadow settlements. They've been living with the consequences of this conspiracy for generations." A muscle twitched in Brody's jaw. "Those people, they're a problem. They disrupt the order of things. They attract unwanted attention. So you protect the people who displace them, the people who engineered a disaster." Lena's voice rose laced with anger. Brody leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I protect this parish, Ms. Hanson. I protect the families who built it, the Moreaus, the Thibodeaux, the LaCroix. They create jobs. They contribute to the economy. They tune the R this community. A few displaced families don't change that, so you're complicit." He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. He wasn't a lawman interested in justice. He was a guardian of the established order, a protector of the powerful. "I'm going to expose this, Sheriff," Lena said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm going to tell the world what happened here." Brody sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're making a mistake. Miss Hanson, a very big mistake, let it go. Leave Darrow, forget you ever came here." Lena shook her head. "I can't." She pushed back from the table and stood up, prepared to walk away. That is when Brody's hand flashed out, gripping her wrist. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Not until you understand the situation." Lena wrenched her wrist free, knocking over a glass of water in the process. She spun around and bolted for the door, ignoring Brody's shouted curses. She needed to get back to the shadow settlements to warn the residents. And she needed to find the original levee plans. Someone had taken them, and she suspected they weren't just trying to silence her. They were trying to control the narrative. She found Earl surprisingly willing to take her back to the settlements. He seemed shaken by the turn of events. "Something's going down, Ms. Hanson," he muttered. "Brody ain't a man to be crossed." As they approached the settlements, Lena noticed something was wrong. The community was eerily quiet. The vibrant life she'd witnessed before was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Marie Dubois met them at the dock, her face pale with fear. "They're here," she whispered. "Men with guns. They're searching the settlements." "Who?" Lena asked. "The sheriff's deputies and others. Men we don't recognize." Lena knew she was walking into a trap, but she had to find out what was going on. She and Earl made their way through the labyrinthine waterways, searching for the original levee plans. They found them in Marie's shack, hidden beneath a pile of fishing nets. But as Lena examined the blueprint, she realized something was terribly wrong. The plans weren't original, they were a forgery, a clever reproduction with subtle but significant alterations. The crucial flaws, the structural weaknesses, had been removed. It was a deliberate misdirection designed to mislead investigators and protect the Riverwatch Society. "They knew we had it," Marie said, her voice trembling. "They wanted us to find this, to think we had the evidence. It is a game, a cruel, twisted game." Suddenly a shout shattered the silence. "There they are. Secure the perimeter." Armed men emerged from the shadows surrounding the shack. They were wearing sheriff's uniforms, but their faces were grim and determined. "It is over, Ms. Hanson," a voice boomed from the dock. It was Brody, Lena, Marie, Earl, and a handful of other residents were cornered, trapped in the heart of the settlements. The floodwaters were rising rapidly, cutting off any chance of escape. "Put down your weapons," Brody shouted, "and come with us peacefully." Lena knew that peacefully meant disappearing, becoming another silenced voice in a long history of corruption. She glanced at Marie, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Run," Lena shouted. "Get everyone to higher ground, I'll hold them off." Before anyone could protest, Lena grabbed the forged blueprint and darted out of the shack, weaving through the narrow walkways. She knew she couldn't outrun them forever, but she could buy the others some time. She ran, adrenaline pumping, dodging gunfire, and leaping over obstacles. The water was waist-deep now, slowing her progress. Just when she thought she couldn't go on, she saw him. Brody blocking her path, his gun drawn. "It didn't have to be this way, Ms. Hanson," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You should have listened to me." Lena stopped, bracing herself for the inevitable. The water swirled around her legs, cold and unforgiving. The rain lashed down, obscuring her vision. Then a new sound cut through the chaos. The screech of tires, the blare of a siren. Another vehicle appeared on the horizon, speeding towards them through the flooded streets. It wasn't a sheriff's patrol car. It was a black pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the downpour. And then she saw who was driving. It was Ethan Moreau, the grandson of the founder of the Moreau Sugar Corporation, his face grim and resolute. Behind him, a group of men armed with rifles jumped out. Brody's expression changed, shifting from cold determination to outright panic. "What are you doing?" he roared at Moreau. Moreau ignored him. Leveling a shotgun at Brody. "Your protection ends now, Sheriff." A chaotic firefight erupted. Lena instinctively ducked for cover, watching in stunned disbelief as the two factions clashed, their bullets shattering the stillness of the flood. A figure waded through the churning water towards her, reaching out a hand. It was Earl. "Get out of here, Miss Hanson," he yelled above the din. "Now, I'll take care of this." Lena hesitated for a moment, then grabbed his hand and let him lead her through the flooded streets, away from the carnage. As they retreated, she glanced back, just in time to see Sheriff Brody fall, clutching his chest. And then the water rose, engulfing everything, leaving only the sound of the storm and the lingering scent of gunpowder. The current tugged at Lena's feet, threatening to sweep her off balance. Earl navigated the small skiff through the flooded streets with practiced ease, his face grim. The shootout had been brutal, swift, and utterly unexpected. "Moreau," he turned on Brody. Lena asked, her voice hoarse. Earl nodded. "Seems there was a falling out. Something about control. Moreau wanted to modernize, open things up. Brody was too deeply entrenched in the old ways." They reached higher ground, finding a small cluster of residents huddled together, shaken but alive. Among them was Marie Dubois, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and relief. "We thought we were going to lose everything," she said, clutching Lena's hand. "You saved us." "I didn't do it alone," Lena replied. "Earl, Marie, all of you, you showed me the truth. But the fight wasn't over." Lena knew the families involved wouldn't go down without a struggle. They would use their wealth, their influence, and their connections to discredit her, to bury the truth. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sheriff Brody. He was pale and bleeding, a makeshift bandage wrapped around his chest. I need to talk to you," he rasped. Leaning heavily against a tree, Lena eyed him with suspicion. "After everything you've done, I was wrong," Brody said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was protecting a lie for too long. I thought I was doing what was best for the parish. But I was just enabling corruption." He explained that he'd been blackmailed, threatened with exposure of a past mistake. The Moreau family had held leverage over him for years, using it to control his decisions. "I have information," he continued, "documents, witnesses, evidence that will put them all away." He handed Lena a sealed envelope. "This is everything. The original records from the land acquisition, the altered levee plans, the names of everyone involved." Lena accepted the envelope, her mind reeling. Brody's betrayal was a shock, but it was also a glimmer of hope. "Why now?" she asked. "I saw the look in your eyes," Brody replied, his voice regaining some strength. "You weren't going to let it go, and I knew I couldn't live with the guilt anymore." Lena knew she couldn't rely on local media to cover the story. They were too closely aligned with the powerful families involved. She needed to bypass the censorship to reach a wider audience. She remembered Mark, her editor at the Tribune. He'd been skeptical at first, but he'd always been a champion of investigative journalism. She used a satellite phone Earl had miraculously salvaged, contacting Mark and relaying everything she'd uncovered. "This is huge, Lena," Mark said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "Absolutely huge. Get me everything you have. We'll run with it." Lena spent the next few hours dictating her report, providing Mark with every detail, every document, every witness testimony. She described the land grab, the altered levee plans, the corruption, and the cover-up Levee. The Tribune published the story online, bypassing the traditional news cycle. It went viral almost immediately, sparking outrage across the state and beyond. Social media exploded with condemnation, and calls for justice echoed across the internet. The Moreau family and their allies launched a furious counterattack, attempting to discredit Lena and her reporting. They called her a sensationalist, a liar, and a troublemaker. They hired crisis PR firms, launched smear campaigns, and threatened legal action. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents provided by Brody, combined with Lena's meticulous reporting, were too damning to ignore. The tide was turning. Within days, the state attorney general launched an investigation. Federal authorities joined the probe, scrutinizing the financial records and land deeds of the Moreau family and their associates. Arrests began. Indictments were handed down. The pillars of Darrow Parish's power structure began to crumble. The hidden community, emboldened by the unfolding events, began the long process of rebuilding. They received an outpouring of support from across the country, donations pouring in to help them repair their homes and restore their lives. Marie Dubois became the face of the movement, tirelessly advocating for justice and accountability. She testified before Congress, sharing her family's story and demanding that the government protect vulnerable communities from exploitation. Lena remained in Darrow for several weeks, documenting the aftermath of the scandal. She witnessed the arrests, the trials, and the slow but steady process of healing. The community was scarred, but not broken. They had faced adversity with courage and resilience, and they had emerged stronger than ever before. As she prepared to leave, Lena received one final message, delivered through an anonymous email. It contained only a few words. "The river always remembers." The message sent a chill down her spine. It was a reminder that the past wasn't truly buried, that the wounds of history ran deep, and it was a warning that the fight for justice was never truly over. Standing on the levee, now reinforced and rebuilt, Lena looked out over the vast expanse of the Mississippi River. The water flowed relentlessly, carrying with it the memories of the past and the promise of the future. She knew that her work was done, but she also knew that the river would continue to whisper its secrets, waiting to be discovered by those who dared to listen. The awards came quickly: a Peabody, a Polk, and a nomination for a Pulitzer. Lena Hansen, once teetering on the brink of professional oblivion, was now hailed as a champion of investigative journalism. She did the requisite interviews, the television appearances, the book signings. Each accolade felt hollow. The flashing cameras and polite applause couldn't wash away the images seared into her memory. The rising floodwaters, the desperate faces of the Shadow Settlement residents, Sheriff Brody's haunted eyes. The weight of what she'd uncovered, the betrayal, the injustice, clung to her like the humid Louisiana air. She'd returned to Baltimore briefly, attempting to reconcile with her past. It hadn't gone well. The source who'd led her astray years ago remained a ghost, a figure shrouded in secrecy and regret. She'd learned to live with the retracted story, to accept that sometimes the truth was elusive and the consequences were devastating. But Darrow had been different. The truth there had been tangible, brutal, and ultimately victorious still. Sleep didn't come easily. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, haunted by the distorted voice on the voicemail. Some things are better left underwater. She dedicated herself to advocating for the shadow settlements, working with local organizations to secure funding for rebuilding, improved infrastructure, and educational opportunities. She testified before Congress again, pushing for stricter regulations on levee construction and greater protection for vulnerable communities. The initial wave of arrests had toppled the most prominent figures in the conspiracy: the Moreaus, the Thibodeaus, the LaCroix. But Lena felt a nagging unease. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. She revisited Darrow, spending weeks poring over financial records and land deeds, aided by a team of researchers she'd hired. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. The corruption wasn't confined to Darrow Parish. It extended to state officials, to powerful lobbying firms, to a network of shell corporations that stretched across the Gulf Coast. The Riverwatch Society hadn't simply been a local fraternal organization. It had been a shadow government, pulling the strings from behind the scenes for decades. Its influence permeated every level of power, protecting its members and shielding them from accountability. "It is bigger than we thought," her lead researcher, a young woman named Sarah, said, her voice grim. "They've been systematically exploiting the Delta for generations, diverting funds, manipulating regulations, and suppressing dissent." Lena felt a surge of anger, but also a grim satisfaction. She had been right to be suspicious. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The new evidence led to a second wave of arrests, reaching higher and higher into the corridors of power. State senators, judges, and even a former governor were implicated in the conspiracy. The fallout was seismic, shaking the foundations of Louisiana's political landscape. Lena used her platform to amplify the voices of the shadow settlement residents, ensuring their stories were heard and their needs were met. She helped them establish a community land trust, giving them control over their own future and protecting them from further exploitation. One evening, Marie Dubois approached Lena, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You didn't just expose the truth, Ms. Hansen," she said softly. "You gave us back our dignity. You gave us hope." Lena smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. It was the first time in months she'd felt a sense of peace. She had made amends for her past mistakes. She had found redemption in the fight for justice. Back in her hotel room, Lena reflected on her journey. She had come to Darrow chasing a story, but she had discovered something far more profound: the resilience of the human spirit, the power of community, and the enduring importance of truth. She packed her bags, preparing to return to her life in Baltimore, but she knew she would never forget Darrow, the river, the settlements. The faces of the people she had met thither, they would forever be etched in her memory. As she checked out of the hotel, the desk clerk handed her a small, unmarked package. "This arrived for you this morning," she said, her voice neutral. "No return address." Lena took the package, her heart quickening with apprehension. She opened it cautiously, revealing a single object, a weathered photograph. It was a black-and-white image, faded with age. It depicted a group of men in dark suits and hats, standing in front of a stately plantation house. They were members of the Riverwatch Society, their faces stern and unyielding. And in the center of the photograph, emblazoned on a banner hanging above the doorway, was the symbol, the serpent coiled around the cane. But scrawled across the bottom of the photograph in faded ink were three chilling words: "The river remembers." Lena stared at the photograph, a cold dread creeping into her soul. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. The Riverwatch Society was still out there, in the shadows, waiting for their opportunity to strike again. They were a malignant force, deeply rooted in the history and fabric of the Delta. She looked out the window towards the Mississippi River, its muddy waters flowing relentlessly towards the Gulf. It was a majestic, powerful force, capable of both creation and destruction. The river had witnessed centuries of secrets, of betrayals, of injustices, and it would continue to flow, carrying those secrets with it, waiting for someone to uncover them, to bring them to light. Lena knew her work wasn't finished, the river remembered, and so would she.